months after the first McDonald's finally opened its doors in Moscow, Pizza Hut followed, also opening a location in Beijing. The communist world was forever changed, reported the New York Times on the Moscow Hut. With toppings like salmon and sardines, the pizzas cater to the Russians' craving for salty foods. The same year, the USSR and America agreed to end chemical weapon production and began allegedly destroying their stock. As for the Soviet Union, the value of consumer goods it manufactured in 1990 was only about $2.1 trillion, and tax revenues were declining as local governments withheld giving money to the central authority because they wanted sovereignty. Revenue from alcohol had also dropped after Gorbachev's dry law, a 2-year policy from 1985 to 1987 that raised the cost of alcohol, prosecuted public intoxication, and restricted sales. The costs of the Soviet-Afghan War, Chernobyl, and cleaning up the 1990 Baku pogrom of Armenians added to the financial pressure, along with anti-Soviet demonstrations. Gorbachev was facing mounting scrutiny from liberals who wanted more lenient policies, like Russian Republic leader Boris Yeltsin, who advocated for Russian autonomy, and he faced criticism from hardline Marxist-Leninists who were pissed off at perestroika and glasnost opening the floodgates for more freedoms and dissent. Because the central authority could remove him as a general secretary, Gorbachev held a presidential election to be decided by the Congress of People's Deputies, people most loyal to him. He won, becoming the USSR's first and only president, and replaced the Politburo with the Presidential Council. In May 1990, Gorbachev met with Bush for continued peace negotiations and approved the unified German state in a treaty that France, the UK, and the US co-signed. Gorbachev's choice to condemn Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in December pissed off Soviet hardliners because they saw Iraq as an ally in the Persian Gulf. But Gorbachev also disagreed with US plans for a ground assault against Iraq, instead calling for peaceful solutions, leading to him winning a Nobel Peace Prize. Gorbachev then publicized the 500 Days program to quickly transition the Soviet economy into the global market via shock therapy, by further decentralizing and inviting more private corporations to invest in the economy. In March 1991, the Warsaw Pact ended, dissolving the Eastern European military alliance and further weakening the Soviet Union's influence. 7 countries joined NATO, including the unified Germany and the new Slovak and Czech separate nations. The devolution of Soviet policy continued when Gorbachev begged for loans from the G7 and other nations to aid in expensive reforms in May 1991. Most countries were reluctant, but Germany gave $60 billion and America gave a $1.5 billion credit guarantee to be used for the purchase of American wheat. This was too much for the Soviet hardliners to bear. In August 91, 8 of them led a coup attempt in Moscow and placed Gorbachev under house arrest. Boris Yeltsin urged Moscow citizens to fight the coup, and tens of thousands of protesters formed chains around the Russian parliament to end the whole thing, which failed 3 days after it began. Shortly after, Gorbachev ratified the amendment that made the Communist Party the ruling party, essentially destroying the one-party state. His status and that of the Soviet Union's was severely weakened. And America was also worried because it would rather deal with one liberalizing Soviet Union than multiple newly independent nation-states. By November, the KGB, the main Soviet security agency, stopped operating. On December 8th, the representatives of Soviet nations Belarus, Russia, and the Ukraine signed an accord establishing the Commonwealth of Independent States and dissolving the Soviet Union. On Christmas Day, 1991, the Kremlin replaced the Soviet flag with the Russian tricolor flag moments after Gorbachev resigned. 15 countries became independent, including Armenia, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Ukraine. The fall of the Soviet Union sent a bunch of countries into a spiral. Boris Yeltsin, who was given a year of special power by Parliament in 1991, immediately lifted price controls in December, causing average Russian consumer prices to shoot up by 2,000%. A third of the population slipped below the poverty line within a year. Yeltsin wanted to quickly release market forces in a dose of shock therapy, like all of the Eastern European post-Soviet Soviet states would, apart from Belarus. Warned a New York Times columnist, Boris Yeltsin's shock therapy for Russia is likely to bring economic anarchy that destroys democracy throughout the former Soviet Union. Economist Naomi Klein argued in her book The Shock Doctrine that numerous countries in the midst of economic, political, and wartime conflicts would experience manipulated shocks to the economy, creating disaster and confusion to facilitate the goals of Western powers and world financial institutions. That'll be a recurring theme during this episode. America supported Yeltsin because it proposed that an unstable ruble would usher in communism again. In addition to a $6 billion International Monetary Fund loan, Russia accepted over $3.6 billion from America through the Freedom Support Act of 1992. After the lifted price controls and loans, the next step was the mass privatization of once state-controlled industries and the biggest transfer of state assets to private owners in world history. But that transfer wasn't anywhere near equitable. In October 1992, the country issued 148 million privatization vouchers that could be used to buy shares of state assets that were going private. The vouchers were worth about 10,000 rubles or $40. And to people experiencing sky-high inflation, they were a quick exchange for some cash because the vouchers could be bought and traded. A concentrated group of future oligarchs who were former black market smugglers, Russian mafia members, or the few legit business owners from the period of perestroika went around buying up vouchers. When the state enterprises were auctioned off around the country, most were vastly undervalued. Between 1992 and 1994, 15,000 such firms were auctioned off, making 70% of the Russian economy private and in the hands of a select few, who would become billionaires. 50% of Russians were living on less than $4 a day between 1993 and 1995, which was 48% more than between 1987 and 1988. The continued economic downturn caused a constitutional crisis in 1993 between Yeltsin and Parliament, who opposed shock therapy and voted to repeal Yeltsin's powers. Boris then led a self-coup, eliminating the opposing governmental bodies, and protests followed. After killing over 147 people during the October coup of 1993, Yeltsin consolidated his power by banning leftist papers and groups, imprisoning dissenters, and fixing a new version of the Constitution to expand his power. That same year, it was reported that there were over 5,000 organized crime groups in Russia with over 100,000 members. Organized crime had been around throughout the Soviet era, but the 90s would see the Russian mafia go global. Heaped on all of this was the fact that Yeltsin was an alcoholic, and during his first of many trips to the White House in 1994, he ended up alone on Pennsylvania Avenue, dead drunk, clad in his underwear, yelling for a taxi, according to Clinton biographer Taylor Branch, trying to get pizza. And he attempted the same stunt the next night. No matter the issue, Yeltsin's pliability to U.S. interests made him the ideal leader of Russia, and he had the Bush and Clinton administration's support throughout his tenure. Along with hyperinflation, the budding oligarchy, the rise of the Russian mafia, a failed war in Chechnya, who had declared independence from Russia in 1991, and Yeltsin's drinking and health problems, there was a collapse of public health infrastructure that dropped life expectancy rates and sharply increased untreated chronic diseases. Let's travel now to Russia in 1995, where Boris Yeltsin was dealing with ongoing hostilities with the Islamic territory of Chechnya. In June 1995, over 129 people were killed when 119 rebels took an East Russian hospital hostage, securing the perimeter of the compound with explosives. 2,000 people were held for 5 tense days by the Chechen rebels, the first such incident in modern Russian history. Russian special forces mounted a series of 3 botched attacks that resulted in several dead hostages, eventually causing the Chechen rebels to release all of the pregnant women, mothers, and children. In exchange for freeing the remaining hostages, the rebels were given safe transport back to Chechnya. The entire incident would provide ample criticism for Yeltsin, who was campaigning for re-election. The following year, during a fragile peace with Chechnya, Mikhail Gorbachev, who had risen in esteem in America and was hated in the former Soviet Union, decided to throw in his bid for the presidency. Wrote David Remnick, "He is despised by the communists, who regard him as no better than the CIA, despised by the great power nationalists, who believe he is responsible for the humiliation of a great power and its army, and despised by liberal Democrats, who feel he never fully shed his allegiance to the nomenclature that raised him." Gorbachev's rating in the opinion polls rarely goes higher than 1%. Running as a social democrat, Gorbachev posed himself as a more centrist candidate than neoliberal Yeltsin and Communist Party leader Gennady Zyuganov. who seemed to be leading Yeltsin in the polls. Yeltsin was advised to cancel the 1996 elections due to his unpopularity and dictator tendencies, but he wasn't as unpopular as Gorbachev. Gorbachev was so disliked that the media barely paid him any attention, and he was allegedly slapped or punched in the face on 2 separate occasions. People attended his rallies just to see a fallen leader and call him a traitor. In St. Petersburg, while on the campaign trail, officials snubbed Gorbachev by refusing to allow him to tour the local factories. In the end, he received 0.5% of the vote, placing 7 out of 11. Russians were essentially made to choose between a return to totalitarianism and the alcoholic Yeltsin, who underwent quintuple bypass heart surgery in November 1996 after downplaying his health issues for months. Yeltsin had the support and election meddling of the Clinton administration. He privately encouraged Clinton to not back Zyuganov, making Clinton reply, "You don't have to worry about that. We spent 50 years working for the other result." The U.S. Treasury Secretary helped push through Russian market reforms to speed up IMF disbursement loans and relieve the Russian economy for more Yeltsin support. The $10.2 billion loan from the IMF, endorsed by Clinton, was announced in February 1996 and helped Yeltsin surge ahead in the polls amidst propaganda that the alternative would be societal collapse and regression. Yeltsin won re-election by over 13 percentage points, though there were allegations of voter fraud. Yeltsin also funded his campaign through the Loans for Shares program, or rigged auctions for state assets, fattening the pockets of oligarchs. While Yeltsin worked out a formal peace treaty with Chechnya that included autonomy for the Chechen, Gorbachev, defeated, accepted an offer from Pizza Hut to star in a commercial that filmed in November 1997 in Red Square.
Это Горбачев.
Горбачев.
Это из-за него у нас в экономике бардак.
Да благодаря ему у нас новые возможности.
Это из-за него у нас политическая нестабильность.
Да благодаря ему у нас свобода.
Полный хаос.
Перспективы.
Политическая нестабильность.
Да благодаря ему у нас есть Pizza Hut.
За Горбачева!
За Горбачева!
За Горбачева!
Sometimes nothing brings people together like a nice hot pizza from Pizza Hut.
Gorbachev refused to eat the edge pizza that was being advertised and was paid nearly $1 million to star with his granddaughter Anastasia in the commercial, which aired the following year internationally, but not in Russia. He said, "I thought it was a people's matter, food. This is why if my name works for the benefits of consumers, to hell with it. I can risk it." While the edge pizza being marketed didn't last, nothing said the era of Soviet Union communism was dead quite like this fast food commercial. So the commercial didn't air in Russia, and they didn't really need to see it anyways because the economy was struggling. The payments from that $10 billion IMF loan were repeatedly delayed and withheld because of Russia's lax tax collection, and smuggling, drug and sex trafficking, and other illicit trades grew. The trafficking of women in Russia and other parts of the former Soviet Union reached new levels by 1998, when journalist Michael Spector exposed the grimy industry in an article titled "Contraband Women." These women ended up everywhere from Israel to America to the teeny chain of US-controlled territory between the Philippines and Hawaii called the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. Wrote Spector, "Economic hopelessness in the Slavic world has opened what experts call the most lucrative market of all to criminal gangs that have flourished since the fall of communism. White women with little to sustain them but their dreams. Pimps, law enforcement officials, and relief groups all agree that Ukrainian and Russian women are now the most valuable in the trade." Spector added, "Israel is a fairly typical destination. Prostitution is not legal here, although brothels are. And with 250,000 foreign male workers, most of whom are single or here without their wives, the demand is great." Police officials estimate that there are 25,000 paid sexual transactions every day. Brothels are ubiquitous. Said one Israeli pimp and club owner, Jacob Golan, "Israelis love Russian girls. They are blonde and good-looking and different from us, and they are desperate. They are ready to do anything for money." When asked if the women were there voluntarily, the pimp said to Spector, I don't get into that," he said, staring vacantly across the club at 4 Russian women sitting on a low couch. "They are brought here and told to work. I don't force them, I pay them. What goes on between them and the man they're with, how could that be my problem?" As trafficking women continued to be profitable, it became a key facet of post-Soviet nations. On June 1st, 1998, Russia defaulted on its debts, causing the collapse of the ruble and a financial crisis. Cash reserves plunged to a frightening $14 billion. After a failed impeachment in early 1999, in August, Yeltsin fired his entire cabinet and appointed a new prime minister, Vladimir Putin. In September, a series of bombs detonated in 4 Russian apartment buildings, killing over 300 people. Chechen rebels were blamed, but they denied being the culprits. The attack, along with a fight in Dagestan between Islamic Chechens and the Russian army in August through September 1999, helped launch the 8-month Second Chechnya War. Putin's handling of the crisis boosted his popularity, and it has been alleged that the bombs were a false flag operation intended to create support for a new war on Chechnya. Bill Clinton criticized Russia in November 1999, saying, "If the attacks on Chechen civilians continue, the extremism Russia is trying to combat will only intensify." Yeltsin warned Clinton to stay out of Russian affairs and noted his hypocrisy in bombing Yugoslavia. But Yeltsin himself was withering in power. Revelations of a bribery scandal were the last straw, and Yeltsin resigned on New Year's Eve 1999, installing Putin as his successor. Putin's first act was declaring immunity for Yeltsin for life. Allegations of human rights abuses of Chechens by Russia rose as fighting continued for the next decade.